funneling millions of dollars to pay for these lawsuits. Miraculously, that was absent from their remarks, nor...
I think we referred to it by using the phrase conspiracy theory.
You did say you don't worry about conspiracy theories, but what is most certainly not a conspiracy theory is that the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party and the agenda of Senate Democrats are identical. Both China and the Democrats want to bankrupt the American energy industry. Both China and the Democrats want to destroy jobs in America, and both China and the Democrats want to increase the price you pay for electricity every month, and they want to increase the price you pay for putting gas in your car every week. That is the agenda of today's Democrat Party. That is the agenda of Communist China. And today's Democrats are not remotely embarrassed to have their left-wing groups funded by Communist China, the world's biggest polluter, because China's interest is weakening and hurting America. It makes you ask why an American political party would have that interest as well.
I would just observe that saying it more loudly doesn't make it more true.
Actually, in Washington, sometimes it does. All right, we will now introduce our distinguished panel. We will start with Attorney General Chris Kobach, who was raised in Topeka, Kansas, where he graduated from Washburn Rural High School. He completed his undergraduate studies in government at Harvard University. I've heard of them. Graduating first in his department and summa cum laude. A Marshall Scholar, he received his PhD in politics from the University of Oxford. He received his JD from Yale Law School, serving as notes development editor of the Yale Law Journal. Attorney General Kobach clerked for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals and shortly thereafter became a professor of constitutional law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law from 1996 to 2011. During that period, Attorney General Kobach received a White House fellowship from President George W. Bush. He served in the United States Department of Justice under Attorney General John Ashcroft as counsel to the Attorney General. Attorney General Kobach served as the 31st Kansas Secretary of State from 2011 to 2019. In 2017, President Trump tapped him to lead the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity. As an attorney in private practice, Attorney General Kobach litigated some of the most high-profile cases in the country, including defending statutes and ordinances against the ACLU on multiple occasions. In 2012, he brought the first challenge to President Obama's DACA amnesty on behalf of 10 ICE agents. In 2022, he represented 36 members of the Air Force and the Air National Guard who were denied a religious exemption to the Biden vaccine mandate. Attorney General Kobach was elected as Kansas's 45th Attorney General in November of 2022. As Attorney General, he led and personally argued multiple challenges to the illegal actions of the Biden administration, including obtaining an injunction stopping Biden's illegal Title IX regulation that would have opened women's locker rooms and facilities on college campuses to biological males. He also stopped the Biden administration's regulation that provided Obamacare benefits to illegal aliens. In 2024, the nation's Republican attorneys general elected him chairman of the Republican Attorney General Association. He lives near Lecompton with his wife, Heather, and their 5 children. Our second witness is David Arkush.
May I? He's a minority witness.
In practice, the chairman has always introduced all the witnesses.
I don't think that is the practice, but that's okay. If you don't want to provide me that courtesy, proceed.
David Arkush is the director of Public Citizens Climate Program. He is an expert on the climate crisis, financial regulations, regulatory law and policy, and consumer and worker protection. He has broad experience building coalitions and advocating for the public interest, having interacted extensively with Congress and regulatory agencies and litigated complex cases in the federal courts. Before running the climate program, David spent 5 years directing Public Citizens Congress Watch Division, where he led strategic research and advocacy campaigns and played key roles in the passage of laws, including the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 and the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008. A Time magazine profile of David notes that he has, quote, advocated for consumer protection, advised breaking up the largest too-big-to-fail banks, and addressed other industry structure issues while investigating the financial sector's myriad ties to the government. David has also taught administrative law and legislation at the University of Richmond School of Law. He graduated with honors from Harvard Law School, where he served as managing editor of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, and with honors from Washington University in St. Louis, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. Our third witness, Scott Walter, is president of Capital Research Center. He served in the George W. Bush administration as special assistant to the president for domestic policy and was vice president at the Philanthropy Roundtable, editing Philanthropy magazine and producing donor guidebooks on assistance to the poor, public policy research, and other topics. Walter has testified to 6 committees in Congress and to the IRS and numerous state legislatures. And he has written for and been quoted in such outlets as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. A Georgetown graduate, he served as a senior fellow at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and as senior editor of AEI's flagship publication. He is the author of Arabella, the Dark Money Network of Billionaires Secretly Transforming America. He and his wife, Erica, have 4 children and live in Virginia. I would ask each of the 3 witnesses to please rise for the oath. If you would raise your right hand, do you swear that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? All of you have answered affirmatively. General Kobach, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about environmental lawfare. As Attorney General of Kansas, I've represented the state of Kansas in multiple environmental cases in this broad category of litigation. Because my experience is greatest in the litigation itself, rather than on the various connections to China, I will focus principally on the litigation, touching briefly on the China connections where I am familiar with them. I want to jump straight to what we see that's new in environmental litigation. We're all familiar with the past decades of litigation. There are 2 new types of litigation we're seeing just in the last few years. First, we are seeing laws or regulations coming from specific states that are extraterritorial in scope. In other words, the law doesn't just regulate the state and the residents of that state. It attempts to regulate the whole country. And I'll give you 2 principal examples of this. And the main way to stop these laws right now and to try to restore federal, nationwide, uniform regulation in the environmental sector is for either the Justice Department or for a state to sue. First, in 2023, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, promulgated their Advanced Clean Fleet regulation, which mandates a transition to zero-emission trucks on highways in California by 2035 for medium-duty vehicles, by 2042 for all other vehicles. But most fleets would have to meet emission targets starting this year in 2025. This CARB regulation masquerades as an in-state rule, but really it is a nationwide rule because of California's scope and because so many ports are in California, trucks have to go through. And if they go through California for one bit of one day, then they are subject to the regulations. It would effectively create a national policy regulating trucks all over the country and, of course, usurp Congress's prerogative, presumably something the committee cares about here. In 2024, Nebraska and Kansas and 15 other states sued California, challenging California's CARB regulation, arguing principally that it was preempted by 2 federal statutes. Candidly, California was never going to win this case in court. You had those 2 express preemption provisions, and then on top of that, they had to get a waiver from the EPA. They applied for that waiver, but by the time of the recent election, had not yet obtained it. And then in January of this year, California backed down, withdrew their waiver request, and entered into settlement negotiations with the plaintiff states, of which I am one. But not all extraterritorial state laws are defeated so easily. The ones that are currently in litigation are the so-called climate change Superfund laws. In late 2024, New York enacted one, and then in early 2025, Vermont followed. The New York law forces climate companies to retroactively pay fines totaling $75 billion for the past 25 years of fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions. The CCP-backed Chinese-American Planning Council lobbied heavily for the New York Superfund law. In February 2025, a group of Republican-led states, 22 of us, sued in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of New York. We are maintaining that it is impliedly preempted by the Clean Air Act, since it obviously interferes with Congress's objective of having a uniform national law. It also violates the equal sovereignty of the states. But I make the point in my written testimony, this is one area where express preemption would be much more helpful. And I'm normally a strong opponent of preemption. I think Congress should reluctantly preempt state laws, and courts should reluctantly read between the lines of congressional statutes to find preemption. But this is one area where I believe express preemption will be helpful to Congress and to the states so that we have a uniform national policy. And there's language I suggest on page 5 of my testimony. The second threat is something the chairman alluded to, and that is lawsuits brought by cities and counties. And these are all over the country. There's over 30 of them. I want to briefly describe a couple of them. One is Rodriguez versus ExxonMobil. In that case, Ford County, Kansas, where Dodge City is one of the plaintiffs attempting to represent not just Ford County, not just Kansas counties, but to represent all counties in America and all of their representatives. In other words, it's purporting to represent everybody in this country. They are bringing a case under the theory of public nuisance, but they are also doing something different. They're attempting to usurp the state's prerogative as parens patriae. That is to say, the state attorneys general have the authority to bring a case to protect the broadly writ health and welfare of the citizens of a state. So in addition to usurping federal authority by trying to make a national policy, in that case against plastics, they are also usurping state authorities. As Kansas Attorney General, I've intervened in that case and also in a companion case or a similar case with similar plaintiffs going after shale oil production in New Mexico. There's another case that's further along. It's Mayor and City Council of Baltimore versus BP. That one's in the Maryland Supreme Court right now. I think that where Congress can be helpful in these cases is in getting to the bottom of where the money is coming from. The cases have been going on for 8 years. There's not a single dollar that's been won in damages, yet tens of millions of dollars in attorney's fees have been expended already. The money is coming from somewhere. The foundations are getting their money from somewhere. It's reasonable to ask if China is part of that equation, and I would hope that there'd be bipartisan support for disclosing foreign funding of third-party litigation. And so, in conclusion, I would say we will continue these fights in court as state attorneys general, but we do need some help from Congress. And I think these are modest requests for legislation, preemption that would preserve the prerogatives shared by both parties for congressional, national, uniform legislation, and also some transparency where foreign entities and foreign countries are engaged in this litigation.
Thank you, General. Mr. Arkush.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Whitehouse, Ranking Member Durbin, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Right now, there's a brutal heat wave afflicting half the United States. Energy costs and insurance premiums are skyrocketing, and we're sitting here in the U.S. Senate talking about Chinese communist conspiracy theories straight out of the 1950s. I don't think this is the right priority. That said, there is a conspiracy here, and it's the obvious one. In plain sight. Big oil has made trillions of dollars in profits over the past several decades, and the industry is extremely harmful. It kills millions of people every year and has cost us trillions of dollars. The industry knew decades ago that burning fossil fuels would cause, in its own words, globally catastrophic harm. What it chose to do with that knowledge is remarkable. Imagine you've learned that something you are doing will cause globally catastrophic harm, will have, quote, serious consequences for humanity's survival. Those are the industry's words. I hope you would stop doing it. If for some reason you can't stop immediately because of the economic importance of your industry, then you could still alert the public and help work towards solutions, including selling safer, better forms of energy yourself. Worst case, you could at least keep quiet while other people go about learning about the problem and figuring out how to fix it. But the oil industry did none of these things. Instead, it actively lied and deceived people, spending millions of dollars on a deception campaign to cast doubt on science that the industry itself knew was correct. They had polling in the 1990s that showed strong public support. and public concern for climate change, and that showed that public support for climate change turned to opposition when people were told that there was scientific disagreement about climate science. So that's what they did, manufacture doubt about climate science and fraudulently claim that scientists disagree about it. Even more remarkable, it's clear they believed the science themselves because they used it. For example, in the 1990s, they raised the height of offshore oil platforms to account for the sea level rise that they predicted. They did this while arguing to the public and Congress that climate science was too uncertain to make any costly economic decisions about it. But they weren't uncertain. They moved to protect their own investments and interests while lying to everyone else. This was all so they could keep profiting enormously. But the rest of us have not profited. Far from it. On the contrary, we're paying dearly. Last year alone, climate-related harms cost Americans nearly $1 trillion, more than 3% of GDP. This is like a stealth tax on all of us. Insurance premiums are skyrocketing due to climate-driven extreme weather. Insurance companies are pulling out of more and more places, even whole states. The chair of the Federal Reserve, as Senator Whitehouse noted, recently testified to a Senate committee that there are whole regions of the country where in 10 or 15 years, you won't be able to get a mortgage and there won't be bank branches or ATMs. This will have devastating economic consequences for our country. A large proportion of climate-related costs are already uninsured, and the burden is increasingly falling on American families and state and local governments. Some of those governments are trying to hold big oil accountable for a fraction of those costs so that the polluters responsible for the damage pay the costs instead of taxpayers getting stuck with the bill. This is a basic principle of fairness, something we teach to our toddlers. You make a mess, you clean it up. Also, the notion that a person who causes damage should pay for it is as old as law itself. You can see it in the Code of Hammurabi, written nearly 4,000 years ago. But oil companies don't like this principle because they're causing more harm than perhaps anyone else in human history. And they don't want to pay what they owe. They don't want the normal rules to apply. They want you to shield them from accountability. And they're pushing for it in part by funding people to spin cockamamie theories about China, like the ones we're hearing today. Speaking of China, if anyone is helping China right now in our political system, it's the party pushing what I think of as a serious energy retreat in the big ugly bill in Congress. Some people call it the big beautiful bill. That bill would put China way, way ahead of the U.S. by strangling our renewable energy, stifling innovation, and locking us into forking over hundreds of billions of dollars every year to the dirty, dangerous, expensive energy of 200 years ago, fossil fuels. The bill could shutter 331 factories and kill 330,000 jobs in the U.S. solar industry alone, mostly in red states, including ones represented by members of this committee. But that's what big oil wants, and that's the industry that happens to fund the elections of politicians supporting the bill and funds a vast network of groups that are still lying on its behalf. That's the conspiracy here, the obvious one in plain sight. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Walter.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Whitehouse, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the honor of testifying. I'm Scott Walter, president of the Capital Research Center, where we study special interests. It's no accident, as the Marxists say, that China has deep ties to the environmentalist movement. Whatever their intentions, radical climate activists advocate policy after policy that objectively strengthens China and weakens America, whether it's hindering our production of energy, boosting China's energy resilience, or making our supply chains dependent on Chinese inputs. As the report by State Armor I cited documents, the Chinese Communist Party has every incentive to support climate activism in America. Unfortunately, as I also document, China finds willing partners in activist groups like the Rocky Mountain Institute, the California China Climate Institute, and Energy Foundation China. The Energy Foundation scheme is not subtle. It's headed by a former influential Chinese government official and sends money to activists at groups like the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Natural Resources Defense Council. It also sends money to activists in universities like Berkeley, UCLA, and Harvard. But foreign nationals in China aren't the only ones who attack our energy independence and threaten to make it harder for working-class Americans to heat and cool their homes and drive their cars and trucks. Billionaires around the world add to the threat. In Australia, the billionaire Andrew Forrest works with American tort lawyers and groups like the Sierra Club and the Center for Climate Integrity to put a major U.S. energy company out of business through lawfare that bypasses the democratic process. A British billionaire, Sir Christopher Hone, also funds the Center for Climate Integrity, as well as law-breaking radicals at Extinction Rebellion. Then there's the biggest foreign national billionaire working to manipulate America's politics, Hans-Jörg Wyss, who's poured over $650 million into the American left. Recipients have included Earth Justice Legal Defense Fund, Climate Works, and the minority witness's employer, Public Citizen. But Wyss is best known for giving $278 million to the 1630 Fund, a 501c4 operated by Arabella Advisors and called by The Atlantic, quote, the indisputable heavyweight of Democratic Party dark money. 1630 passes along tens of millions of dollars to the League of Conservation Voters and other environmental groups. Then there's the New Venture Fund, to which Wyss has given $82 million, and which is also operated by Arabella. They run the largest dark money network in the country on either side. New Venture has donated over $1 million to Mr. Arkush's Public Citizen, and it also runs the Collective Action Fund. That group pays the for-profit firm Scheer Edling to sue energy companies on behalf of states like Rhode Island and cities like Baltimore, in hopes judges will force policies on our country that majorities of Democrats and Republicans oppose, policies that should be resolved through the political process by voters and their elected representatives, not by private lawyers and their ideologically motivated funders. Climate lawfare in America is also funded by homegrown billionaires, many with the same last name, Foundation. Hewlett and Rockefeller philanthropies stand out, joined by many more like Ford and MacArthur, who provide a handful of climate lawfare groups $500 million a year. Billionaire Michael Bloomberg supports lawfare by paying to install activists in state attorney general offices, hoping they'll sue energy companies and achieve policy changes they can't win through Democratic legislatures. So far, they're mostly losing in the courts, too. The New York AG's case was dismissed with prejudice. Climate lawfare raises ethics issues, too. Contingency fees for firms like Scheer Edling presume they're taking a risk. But are they, if they have prior funding? Did these firms disclose that funding to government clients? If the government clients knew, did they disclose the funding to the public? Another ethics problem. The Climate Judiciary Project runs educational programs for judges about climate change and lawsuits. One observer calls it an effort by the climate tort movement to brief judges on the plaintiffs' cases with supposedly neutral information, yet the speakers come from the plaintiffs' witnesses and amicus brief filers. This effort to capture courts deserves your oversight. If the public knew climate lawfare's cost and its ties to foreign influence, they'd be outraged. I hope this hearing begins to reveal the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. What we're seeing is not the rule of law. It's lawfare. These lawsuits aren't meant to succeed on the merits. They're designed to exhaust, to intimidate, and to destroy America.